The ferry horn sounded twice. That was wrong. It always sounded 3 times, once for boarding, once for stragglers, once as it pulled away from the dock. I'd heard that sequence every summer since I was 9 years old. Twice meant something I didn't have a word for yet. I was standing at the top of the hill path with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a cooler in each hand, watching the calliope churn white water as it reversed out of the slip. My brother Danny was 30 feet ahead of me, already at the dock ramp, and I saw him drop his bags and start running. Not jogging, running, the way you run when you understand something your body figured out before your brain did. "It's leaving," he shouted back at me. "Marcus, it's leaving." I didn't drop the coolers. I don't know why. Some part of me was still operating on the old logic, the vacation logic, where the worst thing that could happen was a sunburn, and a missed boat meant waiting 90 minutes for the next one. I walked down the hill, and by the time I reached the dock ramp, the calliope was already 40 yards out, its stern wake slapping against the pilings. There were maybe a dozen of us on the dock. I recognized a few. Patrice Odom, who ran the island's only general store, was standing with her teenage son, Elijah, and she had a hand clamped on his shoulder hard enough that I could see her knuckles even from 20 feet away. There was a couple I didn't know, mid-50s, matching hiking boots, the woman holding a phone to her ear and saying, "Pick up, pick up, pick up," to no one. A man in a faded Coast Guard cap sat on a piling with his elbows on his knees and his head down, like he'd been there a while. And near the end of the dock, standing apart from everyone, was a woman I recognized from the hardware store, lean, maybe 35. Dark hair pulled back tight. Her name was Senna. She had a crowbar leaning against her leg. Danny came back to me, breathing hard, his face doing something I hadn't seen since our father's funeral, this tight arrangement of muscles that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. He was 31, 3 years younger than me, and still built like the college wrestler he'd been before his knee blew out. He put his hands on his hips and stared at the ferry. And then he looked at me and said very quietly, "The crew was running." "What?" "On the ferry, when they cast off. The crew wasn't doing the ropes the way they normally do. They were running, and there were people on the vehicle deck, not in cars, just standing, packed in." I set the coolers down. I looked at the ferry. It was far enough out now that I couldn't see faces, but I could see the vehicle deck was dark. And Danny was right, there were shapes crowded along the stern rail. Too many shapes for a routine crossing. My phone buzzed. A text from our mother, back on the mainland. "Don't come home. Stay on the island. Something is happening in Portland. Don't come home." I showed it to Danny. He read it twice, then handed the phone back and sat down on one of the coolers. He didn't say anything. The man in the Coast Guard cap raised his head. He was older than I'd thought, late 60s. Face sun-damaged and wind-cut, eyes that looked like they'd been staring at something terrible for hours. His name, I'd learn later, was Harlan Jessup, and he'd been the island's unofficial harbor master for 23 years. "Next ferry's canceled," he said, loud enough for everyone on the dock to hear. "All ferries are canceled. I've been on the radio with the Mainland terminal for the past 2 hours. They're shutting down the route." The woman with the phone stopped saying, "Pick up." The hiking couple drew closer together. "Why?" Patrice asked. Her voice was steady, but her hand hadn't moved from Elijah's shoulder. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he pointed toward the far end of the island, past the tree line, toward the rocky beach on the northeast shore. "Because of what washed up on Gull Point this morning." Nobody asked what. Not right away. I think we all understood on some cellular level that asking would make it real, and real was something none of us were ready for. But Senna picked up her crowbar and said, without looking at anyone, "I already saw it. Came in with the tide around 5 a.m. It was a man. Or it had been. It was moving, but not the way a living person moves. And it wasn't alone. The air changed. I can't describe it any other way. One moment, we were a group of strangers and half-strangers, standing on a dock feeling inconvenienced. And the next, we were something else entirely. Something older. Something with teeth. Danny stood up from the cooler and looked at me. And in his eyes, I saw the same calculation I was running. We were on a 3-mile island, 7 miles off the coast of Maine, with no ferry, no schedule for one, and something wrong washing up on the rocks. "How many people are on the island right now?" Danny asked Harlan. Harlan pulled off his cap and rubbed his scalp. "Full-timers, maybe 40. Summer people who came early, another 30 or so. A few stragglers like you. 70 people, a 3-mile island, and the tide coming in." We left the dock in 2 loose groups. Patrice took Elijah and the hiking couple. Their names were Glenn and Marcia Eberhardt, toward the general store, which sat on the island's only real road, about a 1/4 mile inland. Harlan went to the harbor office to keep working the radio. Danny and I followed Senna because she was the only one who seemed to know what she'd seen and what it meant. She walked fast, didn't talk much. The crowbar swung at her side with each stride. She led us up the main path, past the ferry terminal parking lot, 6 cars sitting there with nobody coming back for them, and through a stand of white pines that smelled the way my childhood smelled, that clean, sharp scent I'd associated with freedom my entire life. "You live here year-round?" I asked her. 4 years. "And this morning, what you saw on the beach?" I said what I saw. She didn't slow down. It was a man, bloated, gray. Something wrong with his jaw. It was dislocated or broken, hanging open too wide. He was dragging himself up the rocks on his elbows. There was another one behind him, still in the surf. A woman. She was standing, but her legs were wrong, bent at angles that don't work. She was still walking on them. Danny made a sound beside me. Not a word, just a sound. "What did you do?" I asked. Senna stopped walking and turned to face us. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and completely steady. I watched. From the tree line. The man got about 10 feet up the rocks and then stopped. Went still, like he was, I don't know, listening. Then he started moving again, toward the trees. I left before he got there. And the woman? Still in the surf when I left. The waves kept knocking her down. She kept getting back up. We stood there in the pines for a moment. The wind was coming off the ocean, and I could hear waves, and somewhere distantly, a screen door banging. Normal sounds, island sounds. They felt like a lie now. "Where are we going?" Danny asked. "The Rourke place," Senna said. She started walking again. "It's the most defensible structure on the island." I knew the Rourke place. Everyone who'd ever summered on Hughes Island knew it. It was a stone manor house built in 1891 by a shipping magnate named Aldous Rourke, perched on a granite bluff on the island's western shore. 3 stories, slate roof, walls 2 feet thick. The Rourke family had abandoned it in the 70s, and it had passed through a series of owners who'd each done partial renovations before running out of money or interest. The last I'd heard, it belonged to a trust that rented it out for weddings and retreats. "Is it occupied?" I asked. "Caretaker, a man named Webb. He lives in the groundskeeper's cottage. I already talked to him this morning. He thinks I'm out of my mind." "Are you?" Senna looked at me sideways. Something that might have been a smile moved across her mouth and disappeared. Guess we'll find out. The Rourke place emerged from the tree line like something from a different century. Gray stone, tall windows with iron frames, a wraparound porch with thick columns. It sat on a natural shelf of granite about 50 feet above the waterline, with a clear sight line in 3 directions. The fourth side, the east-facing side, backed up against a dense wall of spruce forest. The grounds were overgrown but not wild, and there was a gravel drive that curved up from the main road. Webb was on the porch. He was a big man, mid-40s, red-bearded, arms like dock rope. He was sitting in an Adirondack chair drinking coffee as if nothing in the world had changed. A rifle leaned against the railing beside him, a lever action that looked well used. "You brought friends," he said to Senna. "I brought hands," she said. "The ferry's gone, all routes canceled." Webb took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked at Danny and me the way a mechanic looks at parts that might or might not fit. "You boys know anything useful?" "I'm an architect," I said. "I was an EMT," Danny said, "before I managed a restaurant." Webb nodded once, like that was exactly the unremarkable answer he'd expected. "So you can build things and patch people." "All right." He set down his coffee and picked up the rifle. "Come inside. I want to show you something." He led us through the front hall. High ceilings, stone floors, a staircase that curved up into shadow and into a back room that had been converted into a kind of office. Maps on the walls. A marine radio on a desk, crackling softly. And taped to the wall above the radio, a series of photographs that Webb had printed on regular computer paper. They were screenshots from a news broadcast. The resolution was poor, but I could make out enough. A street it looked like Portland. Congress Street maybe, and in the street, figures. Dozens of figures. Some were on the ground. Some were standing. Some were in positions that didn't make anatomical sense. Limbs at angles that suggested the bones inside had stopped mattering. "Came across the wire about 4 hours ago," Webb said. "Portland, Bangor, Lewiston. Then Boston. Then it stopped coming across the wire because the wire went down." "What is it?" Danny asked. He was staring at the photos with a rigidity I recognized the EMT in him, trying to assess, categorize, triage. "Does it matter what we call it?" Senna said from the doorway. She was right. It didn't matter. What mattered was the 3-mile island, the 70 people, the things in the surf, and the walls, the 2-foot-thick stone walls that surrounded us right now. I looked at the room. I looked at the maps. I looked at the radio. And I felt something click in my chest, like a lock engaging. "We need to bring everyone here," I said. "Everyone on the island. Today." Webb studied me for a long moment. Then he leaned the rifle against the desk and pulled the island map off the wall, spreading it across the table like a surgical drape. "Then let's talk about how." We split up before noon. Senna and Danny took the main road south toward the cluster of summer cottages near Alder Cove. Webb went to the harbor to get Harlan and whatever supplies the harbor office had. I went to the general store. The walk took 12 minutes, and they were the loneliest 12 minutes of my life. Not because of what might be in the trees, though that thought lived in my throat like a bone, but because for those 12 minutes, I was alone with the full weight of what was happening. No one to perform competence for, no one to calibrate my fear against. Just me and the road and the pines and the knowledge that the world I'd driven up to yesterday, the world where I had a firm and a mortgage and a reservation for 2 at a sushi place in Portland next Friday, was already gone. I could feel it the way you feel a tooth that's been pulled, the absence more real than the thing had ever been. Patrice had the store locked when I arrived. I knocked and she opened the door just wide enough to see me, then let me in. Inside, Glenn and Marcia Eberhardt were sitting on folding chairs near the register, and Elijah was in the back, moving canned goods from a shelf to a cardboard box with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd been told to stay busy. "The Rourke place," I said to Patrice. "It's our best option. Stone walls, high ground, sight lines on 3 sides. We're gathering everyone." Patrice listened with her arms crossed. She was a tall woman, early 50s, with short gray hair and a face that had spent decades not tolerating nonsense. She'd run this store through nor'easters, supply shortages, and the full carnival of summer tourists. She was, I realized, exactly the kind of person you wanted in a crisis. "How many can it hold?" she asked. "Comfortably?" 30. "But it's a big building. 3 floors, multiple rooms. We can fit more." "And food?" "That's why I'm here." She looked at me for a long moment, then turned to Elijah. "Get the truck keys." We loaded Patrice's flatbed with everything that mattered. Canned goods, dry goods, bottled water, first aid supplies, batteries, flashlights, propane canisters. We took the store's entire stock of duct tape, rope, and plastic sheeting. Marcia Eberhardt turned out to be a retired nurse, and she sorted the medical supplies with a precision that made me grateful. Glenn Eberhardt stood by the truck and watched the tree line. He didn't say much, but his eyes never stopped moving. When I asked him what he did before retirement, he said, "Wildlife management. 30 years with the Forest Service." He paused. "I've tracked things through woods my whole life. I know what a woods looks like when something new is in it." And he pointed toward the northeast, toward the Gull Point. "The birds are wrong over there. Have been since dawn. Gulls won't land. Crows are circling but won't drop. Something's moving in the underbrush that the animals don't recognize." We loaded the truck in silence after that. By 3 o'clock, we'd made contact with most of the island. Senna and Danny had rounded up 14 people from the summer cottages, families mostly, including a young couple named Theo and Bryn, with a 4-year-old daughter, Lily, and an older man named Corwin, who'd been a commercial fisherman for 40 years and had a boat he refused to leave. Danny had spent 20 minutes convincing him. In the end, Corwin came. But he brought a gutting knife and a look that said he'd go back for that boat the moment he decided to. Webb brought Harlan, plus a retired couple from the Harbor Road and a young woman named Ray, who'd been working as a seasonal kayak guide. Ray was 23, athletic, and had the particular calm of someone who'd spent a lot of time alone on open water. She also had a hand-crank emergency radio, which instantly made her one of the most important people on the island. We gathered in the Rourke Place's great room, a wide, high-ceilinged space with a stone fireplace and tall windows that looked out over the bluff. I counted heads. 38 people. We were still missing at least 30, scattered across the island's far ends. I stood by the fireplace and spoke. "I'm not a public speaker. I'm an architect. I talk to clients about load-bearing walls and zoning variances. But someone had to say it. Most of you know pieces of what's happening. Here's what we know for certain." I laid it out. The ferry, the canceled routes, the things on Gull Point, the news from the mainland. I kept it factual. I kept it short. I watched faces change as I talked, watched the stages compress, denial and bargaining happening in seconds instead of hours, because there wasn't time for the luxury of gradual acceptance. Theo held his daughter against his chest and looked at his wife. Bryn's face was blank, not calm, but locked. like a system that had shut down non-essential functions. "What are we supposed to do?" someone asked. I didn't see who. And then Senna stepped forward and unrolled the map of the Rourke property that Webb had given us and pinned it to the wall beside the fireplace. On it, she'd already begun marking sight lines, entry points, vulnerable sections of the tree line, and the locations of every exterior door and ground floor window. "We build," she said. "We build and we watch, and we don't stop doing either until we know more." That night, I lay on the floor of a second-story room with Danny's breathing 10 feet away and a window that looked out over black water, and I listened. The ocean, the wind in the spruce, and somewhere, faint enough that I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it, a sound from the northeast shore that might have been a human voice and might have been something that remembered how to use one. The first morning inside the Rourke place, I woke to the sound of hammering. Webb was already on the ground floor, boarding up windows with plywood from the property's maintenance shed. He worked methodically, without urgency, the way a man works who's decided that panic is a luxury he can't afford. I found Senna in the kitchen, a massive institutional space, from the building's stint as an event venue, inventorying our food supply with Patrice. They'd laid everything out on the stainless steel counters, and the math was visible at a glance. Not enough. Enough for 38 people for maybe 12 days if we rationed carefully. 14 if we got aggressive. "We need to go back out," Patrice said, not looking up from her notebook. "There's food in the summer cottages. Pantries, freezers. Some of those places are stocked for full season stays." "Agreed," I said. "But we need a plan for the perimeter first. I don't want people going out and coming back without a system." I spent the morning walking the Rourke grounds with Webb and Glenn. The architect in me took over. It was the only useful thing I had to offer. And I leaned into it the way Danny leaned into triage protocols. I saw the property not as a building, but as a system. Walls, sight lines, choke points, failure points. The main house sat on a granite ledge with a steep drop on 3 sides, north, west, and south. The bluff was 30 to 50 feet high, depending on the section, and the rock face was sheer enough that nothing was climbing it without equipment. That gave us natural protection on 3/4 of the perimeter. The east side was the problem. The spruce forest came within 80 feet of the back of the house, and the ground was level, with a gentle slope running down to a meadow and then into thick woods. "That's our soft side," Glenn said, standing at the tree line, his eyes doing the tracking thing I'd already started to trust. "Anything coming from the interior of the island comes through there." "Can we clear it?" "Some. We can take down the closest trees, open the sight line. But that's a week of work with chainsaws, and the noise is a consideration." The noise. I hadn't thought about that. About what sound might attract. "What about a barrier?" I asked. "Not a wall, we don't have time or materials. Oh, but something that slows movement and makes noise when it's disturbed." Webb was already nodding. "Wire. I've got 300 feet of fencing wire in the shed. Fishing line, too. We string it low, hang tin cans, bottles, anything that rattles. Won't stop them, but it'll tell us they're coming." We spent the rest of the day on it. I drew up the plan, a zigzag pattern of wire at knee height across the entire eastern approach, with deeper lines staggered at 15-foot intervals. Danny and Ray handled the physical work, stringing wire between tree trunks and iron stakes that Webb drove into the ground with a mallet. Elijah and 2 of the summer kids collected cans and bottles and strung them on fishing line every 3 feet. By sunset, we had a rudimentary early warning system covering 150 feet of the eastern perimeter. It was ugly and improvised, and wouldn't survive a determined push. But it would make noise, and noise meant time. and time meant we could react. That evening, I organized the first watch rotation. 4-hour shifts, 2 people per shift, covering the east-facing windows on the second floor. Webb took the first shift with Corwin, who'd barely spoken since arriving, but who had the fisherman's gift of patient stillness, the ability to watch water for hours without losing focus. I took the second shift, midnight to 4, with Ray. We sat in a dark room on the second floor with the windows cracked open, listening. Ray had her emergency radio, and every 30 minutes she'd scan the frequencies, mostly static. Once, a fragment of an automated emergency broadcast the word shelter and a string of numbers, then nothing. "You okay?" I asked her around 2 in the morning, because she'd been quiet for a long time. "I keep thinking about my kayaks," she said. "Down at the harbor, 12 of them, just sitting on the rack. And I keep thinking, stupidly, about how I need to rinse them because salt water damages." She stopped, laughed once without humor. "Salt water damage, as if that matters." "It matters because it's yours," I said. "It matters because it's the thing you understood yesterday." She was quiet for a while after that. Then she said, "Do you think the mainland is gone?" "I don't think we know enough to answer that." "That's an architect's answer." "Yeah, it is." Somewhere in the trees, a can rattled. We both went rigid. Ray turned off the radio. I pressed my face close to the glass and stared into the dark, trying to make the shadows resolve Ashore into shapes. Another rattle, closer, then another. Something was moving through our wire field, hitting the trip lines, and it wasn't stopping. I grabbed the flashlight Webb had left us and aimed it out the window. And in the beam, I saw movement, a shape at the tree line, low to the ground, dragging itself forward through the underbrush. It hit another wire line, and the cans erupted in a tinny cascade. The shape didn't flinch, didn't react to the sound at all, just kept moving, pulling itself forward on its arms, its legs trailing behind it at angles that confirmed what Senna had described. It was maybe 60 feet from the house. "Get Webb," I told Ray. She went. I stayed at the window with the flashlight and watched it come. Webb arrived in under a minute, rifle in hand, Corwin behind him with a fire axe he'd pulled from the hallway mount. Danny was awake too. He'd heard the cans. And he stood in the doorway with a look that was half EMT assessment, half the older brother protectiveness he'd deny possessing. I kept the flashlight on the shape. It had cleared the first wire line and was now in the open ground between the tree line and the house. In the beam, details materialized that I'd spent years trying to forget. It had been a man. He was wearing a fleece jacket and jeans weekend clothes, Mainland clothes. His face was swollen and discolored, the skin tight and shining, mouth open in that permanent gape Senna had described, the jaw hinging too low. His eyes caught the light and reflected it wrong, a milky luminescence that had nothing to do with life. He was pulling himself forward with his arms because his legs were broken below the knee, the bones visible through the denim. And he was making a sound, not a moan, not a growl, but something wet and rhythmic, like breathing through a throat full of water. He was 40 feet from the house, then 30. "I've got the shot," Webb said calmly. He had the rifle braced on the windowsill, his eye to the scope. "Wait," I said. Everyone looked at me. I didn't know why I'd said it. Some part of my brain, the analytical part, the part that drew buildings and solved structural problems, was watching this thing with a sick fascination, cataloging its movement pattern, its speed, its reactions. It hadn't responded to the light. It hadn't responded to the sound of the cans. It seemed to be moving in a straight line toward the house. which meant it was orienting on something, but I couldn't tell what. It's not reacting to the flashlight, I said. Move to the next window. Let me test something. I turned off the flashlight. In the sudden dark, I heard the thing still moving, the wet sound of it dragging across grass. I went to the adjacent window, 20 feet to the right, and turned the flashlight back on. The beam hit the ground 10 feet from the crawler, and it did not change direction, still coming straight toward the window where I'd been standing. It's not following light, I said. It was heading for where we were talking. Sound, Senna said. She'd appeared in the doorway. I hadn't heard her come up the stairs. They follow sound. Webb adjusted his aim. We done testing? I nodded. The shot was very loud in the room. The crawler's head snapped sideways, and it stopped moving. The silence afterward was immense, a silence that felt physical, that had weight and texture, a silence I knew every person in the house was now listening to. Awake and rigid in their bedding, hearts hammering. We watched for 30 minutes. Nothing else came out of the trees. The cans were still. At dawn, Webb and Corwin went out to examine the body. I watched from the window. Webb crouched beside it, studied it for a long time, then came back inside. His face was arranged in the expression of a man updating his understanding of the world. It's not decay, he said. Not the way I know it. The tissue is wrong, fibrous almost, like something is growing through it. And the bones, the broken legs, there's new growth around the fractures, not healing, more like reinforcement, like something's trying to make the broken parts work again. Danny asked the question nobody else would. Is it contagious? I don't know. I'm a caretaker, not a doctor. Webb looked at Marcia Eberhardt, who'd come downstairs. She met his gaze and shook her head slightly. I'm a nurse, she said. Retired. I don't know what this is. Nobody does. What I know is that we don't touch it without gloves, we don't go near the fluids, and we bury it or burn it before the day gets warm. We burned it. Built a pyre on the rocks at the edge of the bluff, and used propane from the kitchen to get it going. The smoke went up thin and black, and everyone watched from the windows. And nobody said anything about how a body shouldn't move after the brainstem is destroyed, because we'd all seen it still twitching in the flames until there was nothing left to twitch. I pulled Senna aside that afternoon. We stood on the porch, watching the water. The mainland was a blue-gray line on the horizon, and you could see the faint shape of the Portland skyline if you knew where to look. No lights. Even in daylight, you could tell there should have been glint and movement over there, and there wasn't. We need to go back to Gull Point, I said. We need to know how many came ashore. That's 1.5 miles through the woods. I know. Through the part of the island we haven't secured. I know that too. Senna looked at me, and for the first time I saw something behind the composure. Not fear, but the exhaustion of someone who'd been afraid since 5 a.m. yesterday and had simply refused to show it. All right, she said. But we go armed, we go quiet, and we don't go alone. 3 of us went to Gull Point, me, Senna, and Glenn. We left at first light on the 3rd morning, carrying the crowbar, a hatchet, and Webb's rifle, which he gave to Glenn because Glenn was the better shot, and Webb was honest enough to say so. The walk took 40 minutes. We moved through the spruce forest on the island's interior trail, a path I'd hiked 100 times as a kid. And every step felt like reading a familiar book in a language that had changed overnight. The trees were the same. The moss, the ferns, the granite boulders furred with lichen all the same. But the birds were wrong, as Glenn had said. No song. Occasional alarm calls from deep in the canopy, the sharp chip-chip of something startled. And once, a smell faint, sweet, chemical, like nothing I could place, that drifted through a gap in the trees and then vanished. Glenn walked point. He moved through the woods the way water moves through rock, finding the path of least resistance, stepping on stone instead of sticks, pausing at intervals to read the ground. Twice he crouched and examined broken branches, then moved on without comment. The third time, he stayed crouched for a long moment. "Here," he said quietly. We came up behind him. He was pointing at the ground. In the soft earth beside the trail, there were marks, not footprints exactly, but drag marks. The furrows left by something pulling itself across soil. They crossed the trail at an angle and disappeared into the underbrush on the downhill side. "How old?" Senna asked. "Hours, maybe since last night." We followed the trail downhill, and it joined other marks, more drag paths. And these were accompanied by footprints, actual footprints, but wrong. The spacing was uneven, the impressions too deep on one side, as if the walker was listing, off balance, compensating for structural damage. There were at least 4 distinct tracks. Gull Point was a crescent of granite and gravel on the northeast shore, backed by a wall of scrub pine. We came out of the trees above it and looked down. The beach was empty, but it hadn't been empty recently. The gravel was disturbed in a wide swath from the waterline to the tree line, the kind of disturbance that spoke of multiple bodies crawling, dragging, standing. There were scraps of clothing caught on the rocks, a single running shoe, the laces still tied. And in the shallows, half submerged, the gray-white shape of a body face down in the water, rocking gently with the waves. It wasn't moving. Glenn swept the tree line through the rifle scope. "Clear, for now." We climbed down to the beach. The evidence told a story I assembled the way I'd assemble a blueprint piece by piece, connection by connection. At least 6 individuals had come ashore here, based on the track patterns. Most had come from the water, which meant they'd drifted, probably carried by the current from the mainland. They'd come ashore at different times. Some of the tracks were older, partially erased by tide, while others were fresh. And they'd all gone the same direction, inland, toward the island's populated areas. Toward us. Senna stood at the waterline, looking at the body in the shallows. "It's not moving," she said. "The water might slow them down. Cold water, maybe." "Or it's already done," Glenn said. "Spent whatever drives them." I looked out at the ocean. The current between the island and the mainland ran northeast to southwest, which meant anything in the water near the coast could wash up here. The mainland was 7 miles away. Could these things survive 7 miles of open ocean? The one we'd burned had been waterlogged, swollen, its lungs certainly full. It hadn't needed to breathe. "This is going to keep happening," I said. "Every tide, there's a chance more wash up." Glenn lowered the rifle. He looked at me with an expression I'd come to associate with bad weather, not surprise, just acknowledgement. "Every tide," he confirmed. "We went back faster than we'd come." I had what I needed. Numbers, direction, pattern. 6 that we knew of, at least 1 destroyed. 4 or more loose on the island, somewhere between Gull Point and the Rourke place. And the ocean was a conveyor belt that would keep delivering. When we got back, I gathered everyone in the great room. I told them what we'd found. I told them about the tides. I watched Bryn pull Lily closer, watched Theo's hand find his wife's, watched Corwin's jaw set in a way that spoke of calculations he was making about that boat in the harbor. Then I unrolled my drawings. I'd spent the previous evening working by lamplight, drafting on the back of old event menus from the Rourke Place's hosting days. Plans, structural plans, not for a building, for a fortress. We can't just watch and wait, I said. We need walls, real walls. We have stone on this island, more granite than we can use in a lifetime. We have timber. We have 38 sets of hands. And we have an architect. I spread the plans on the table. A perimeter wall, 8 feet high, encircling the main house and the eastern approach. A watchtower at the northeast corner. A reinforced gate on the main drive. Internal barricades on the ground floor. A rooftop observation platform. This isn't overnight work, I said. This is a week, maybe 2. But when it's done, this isn't a house we're hiding in. It's a position we're holding. Senna studied the plans. Webb studied the plans. Harlan, who'd been quiet for days, leaned forward in his chair and studied the plans. And it was Patrice, pragmatic, unsentimental Patrice, who spoke first. Elijah and I can run the commissary. 3 meals, rationed, no arguments. She looked at Elijah, who nodded. You build, we'll keep you fed. It was the closest thing to a vote we ever took. The construction started on day 4. I divided the 38 of us into teams based on what people could do, not what they'd done for a living. Theo had been a high school math teacher, but he was strong and precise and became my best stone setter. Ray had never used a chainsaw, but she learned in an afternoon and worked the eastern tree line with a focus that bordered on devotion. Corwin, despite his obvious resentment at being landlocked, turned out to have an engineer's instinct for leverage and load distribution. 40 years of rigging fishing nets had given him an understanding of tension and force that translated directly to wall construction. We quarried stone from the bluff face on the south side, where the granite fractured in clean slabs along natural fault lines. Webb showed us how to use iron wedges and sledgehammers to split the rock, a technique he'd learned maintaining the Rourke property's original walls. It was brutal, slow work. By the end of the first day, my hands were blistered raw. My shoulders ached in places I didn't know contained muscle. And we'd moved approximately 40 feet of stone to the eastern perimeter. Danny ran the medical station. He set up in a ground floor room near the kitchen, cleaned and organized Marcia's supplies, and treated a steady stream of cuts, bruises, and 1 dislocated finger that Theo suffered on the 2nd day of quarrying. Danny was good at this, better than he'd been at managing the restaurant, maybe better than he'd been at wrestling. He had a way of touching people that was both clinical and gentle. And I watched him reset Theo's finger while talking to him about his daughter's favorite cartoon. And I thought, this is who my brother is, when the world lets him be himself. The wall grew. Not fast, not the way walls grow in movies, where a montage covers weeks. It grew in inches, in arguments about mortar mix and foundation depth, in the particular agony of lifting a 50-pound slab of granite to shoulder height and setting it in place with hands that had stopped being able to fully close. But it grew. By day 6, the eastern wall was 3 feet high and 40 feet long. By day 8, it was 5 feet high and beginning to curve around the northeast corner. I modified the plans daily, adapting to the reality of available stone, the contours of the ground, the limitations of a workforce that included a 4-year-old and a 68-year-old harbor master with a bad hip. The infected came twice during the building. The first time was day 5. A single figure emerged from the tree line at dusk, walking upright but with that wrong gait, that broken puppet movement. It walked directly into our wire field, and the cans erupted, and Webb put it down from the 2nd floor window with a single shot. We burned it on the bluff that night. The second time was day 7, and it was worse. 3 of them came from different directions, within minutes of each other, as if they'd been wandering separately and something had drawn them together. 1 came from the east, through the wire field. 1 came from the south, somehow having climbed a section of the bluff that I'd assessed as unclimbable. The granite was slick with spray, and the thing had pulled itself up, using grip strength that no living human body could produce. The 3rd came down the main drive, walking almost normally. And this was the worst because for a moment, in the fading light, it looked like a person. It looked like someone coming to join us. Corwin killed the one on the drive with his gutting knife. I didn't see it happen. I was on the other side of the house, helping Webb with the one from the bluff. But I heard about it later. Heard how Corwin had walked out to meet it with the knife held low and had done what 40 years of killing fish had made reflexive. He didn't talk about it, but that night he sat on the porch alone. And when I brought him coffee, his hands were shaking so badly the mug rattled against his teeth. "It was wearing a wedding ring," he said. "The one on the drive. Gold band, left hand." I sat beside him. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wasn't obscene in its inadequacy. "My wife is on the mainland," he said after a while. "Ellen. She's in Rockland, at her sister's. I was supposed to go back next week." He set the coffee down. "What do you think happened in Rockland?" I told him I didn't know. It was the truth, and it was also a mercy. Because what I thought had happened in Rockland was the same thing that had happened everywhere else. And saying so would have been an act of cruelty that served nothing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I climbed to the roof, a flat section above the 3rd floor that I'd earmarked for the observation platform, and sat in the dark and looked at the mainland. No lights. Not a single point of light on the entire visible coastline. The sky was brilliant with stars, more stars than I'd ever seen from this island, because the light pollution from the coast was gone. All of it. Gone. I was looking at a dead coast, lit by stars that didn't know it. Day 10 brought the crisis I should have anticipated but didn't. Corwin was gone. He'd left sometime before dawn. Slipped past the watch, which that night had been Ray, and one of the summer residents, a quiet man named Dale, who turned out to sleep through most of his shifts, and gone to the harbor. When we realized he was missing, Webb and I went down to the dock and found his slip empty. He'd taken his boat. I stood on the dock and watched the horizon. The water was calm, a sheet of gray silk. And somewhere out there, Corwin was motoring toward Rockland in a 30-foot fishing boat with a gutting knife and a need I couldn't fault him for. He was going for Ellen. Every cell in my body understood why, and every rational calculation I could run told me he was going to die. Danny stood beside me. Should we have locked the boats? We're not a prison. Maybe we need to be, a little bit. This was the first real argument between us, not about Corwin specifically, but about what we were becoming, what the fortress demanded of us. Danny wanted structure, rules, consequences for breaking them. He'd been an EMT long enough to know that chaos in a crisis kills more people than the crisis itself. And he'd watched Dale sleep through his watch shift and nearly let 3 infected walk into our construction zone. I resisted. Not because he was wrong, but because the thing he was describing, rules, enforcement, authority, required someone to be in charge. And the shape of these past 10 days had put me in that position without anyone explicitly saying so. I'd drawn the plans. I'd organized the teams. People came to me with problems, and I hadn't wanted any of it. I'd wanted to build a wall, not govern a settlement. "You're already doing it, Marcus," Danny said. "You're just doing it without admitting it, which means you're doing it badly." That landed the way only a brother's words can, with the precision of someone who's had 34 years to learn exactly where your soft tissue is. We held a meeting that afternoon. I laid out the new protocols with Danny standing beside me. And I watched his face for approval the way I'd watched our father's face when I presented my first architectural drawings. And I hated myself a little for needing it. The rules were straightforward. No one leaves the perimeter alone. Watch shifts are mandatory. And sleeping through one means double shifts for a week. The gate gets barred at sunset and doesn't open until a two-person team confirms the approach is clear at dawn. Weapons are assigned, not chosen, and no one takes a boat without the group's agreement. The last rule was a ghost. Corwin was already on the water, and we were legislating against a thing that had already happened. But it was also a line in the sand. We were declaring that survival here was collective, that individual decisions carried collective risk, and that the freedom we'd all grown up believing was our birthright had, like so many other things, been carried away on a ferry that sounded its horn only twice. 2 people objected. One was Dale, who resented the implication about his watch performance and said so in a voice loud enough to carry through the house. The other was a woman named Francine, a summer resident in her 40s who'd been largely invisible until now, and who argued, not unreasonably, that no one had elected me to anything. "You're right," I said. "No one elected me. If someone else wants to draw the plans and organize the builds and make the calls, I'll hand it over right now. I'll go back to laying stone." Nobody volunteered. Francine sat down. The rules stood. That night, Senna found me on the porch. She had a bottle of whiskey she'd found in the Rourke Place's cellar, good whiskey, the kind the wedding clients had probably paid $30 a pour for. She poured 2 glasses and handed me one. "Francine's not wrong," she said. "I know. But she's not right either. Not right now. Right now, someone has to decide things. And you're the one who can see how buildings work, which means you're the one who can see how this works." She gestured at the wall, the wire field, the house. "None of this holds together without a blueprint. And you're the only one here who thinks in blueprints. What about you? What about me? You showed up with a crowbar and a plan on day 1. You'd already talked to Webb. You'd already scouted the property. You were ahead of all of us." Senna drank her whiskey. The moonlight caught the glass. "I grew up in a house where being ahead was the only way to survive," she said. "My father wasn't a bad man. He was an unpredictable one. I learned to read weather early, the kind that walks through a front door at midnight. So yeah, I see threats before other people do. But seeing threats and building something that withstands them are different skills. You have the second one. I have the first." We sat in silence for a while. The ocean was black and vast, and the mainland was invisible. And somewhere on that water, Corwin was either alive or he wasn't. And there was nothing we could do about it either way. "I'm scared," I said. It was the first time I'd admitted it out loud to anyone. "Good," Senna said. "Scared people build better walls." The wall was finished on day 14. 8 feet high, 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top. Running 220 feet along the eastern approach and curving around both corners to meet the natural bluff. A gate of doubled timber beams, cross-braced with iron brackets from the Rourke maintenance shed, sealed the main drive. The Watchtower, a raised platform of stacked stone and timber, 12 feet high, stood at the northeast corner, giving a clear view of the tree line and a section of the northern coastline. I stood at the base of the wall and put my hand on it, and felt the granite's cold certainty against my palm. I'd designed buildings before, residential, commercial, once a small library in Yarmouth that I was proud of. But I'd never designed anything whose failure would kill people I knew. The weight of that was different from any engineering challenge I'd faced. It wasn't a matter of load calculations and safety margins. It was a matter of Lily's face, of Elijah's quiet competence, of Danny's hands, steady hands, healer's hands, and whether the thing I'd built would keep those hands alive. We lost our first person on day 15, not to the infected, to the ocean. Dale went fishing. He'd been chastened by the watch incident, had served his double shifts without complaint, and had asked permission properly, through me, to take one of the harbor kayaks out to the cove on the west side, where the mackerel ran in the mornings. We needed the food. I said yes. I sent Ray with him, because the rule was no one goes alone. They went out at dawn. At 7:30, Ray came back alone, paddling hard, her face white. Dale had seen something in the water, a shape, she said, moving just below the surface, close to the rocks at the mouth of the cove, and he'd leaned over to look and capsized. The water there was cold, low 50s, and Dale wasn't a strong swimmer. Ray had gotten her kayak to him in under a minute, but by then the current had him, pulling him toward the rocks, and something else had him too. It came from underneath, Ray said. She was sitting on the floor of the medical station, Danny wrapping a blanket around her, her voice flat and disconnected, the way voices get when the mind is trying to process an event the body has already filed under unacceptable. It was in the water, under the surface. It grabbed his leg and pulled, and he went under. And I saw the water change color around him. And then he came back up, but only for a second, and he wasn't the sound he made, wasn't. She stopped. Danny held her. I stood in the doorway and understood that the ocean, the thing I'd been counting on as our moat, our natural barrier, was compromised. They were in the water, not just drifting active, mobile, present. The island's greatest defense had a flaw I couldn't engineer around. I called a meeting. I banned water access, all of it. No fishing, no kayaking, no swimming, no going near the waterline without armed escort. The western cove was off limits. The harbor was restricted to the dock area only, and only for supply runs from the boats moored there. Theo objected. Not loudly. Theo never did anything loudly, but with the quiet mathematics of a man who'd been tracking our calorie intake. We can't sustain on what we have without supplementing from the ocean. The cottages gave us another week, maybe 10 days. After that, we're short. Then we find another way, I said. What other way? We're on a rock in the Atlantic. We have soil. We have seeds. Marcia found them in one of the cottages, a full garden kit. We have time, if the walls hold. That's a bet, Theo said. Everything is a bet now. That night I found Senna on the Watchtower. She was looking east, toward the tree line, and she had the crowbar across her lap the way another person might hold a rosary. I climbed up beside her and sat down. You heard about Dale, I said. I heard. The water isn't safe. The water was never safe, Marcus. We just wanted it to be. Below us, the wall ran its long curved path through the moonlight, solid and real, the thing we'd built with our raw hands and our fear. Inside it, 37 people were sleeping or trying to. And outside it, the world was full of things that used to be people, and an ocean that had swallowed a man while something pulled him down. I looked at the wall and felt for the first time not pride, but terror, the specific terror of the builder who understands that every structure, no matter how strong, is ultimately a negotiation with forces that don't negotiate. They came on day 19. Not the ones and twos we'd been managing, not the solitary crawlers tripping wire in the dark. This was different. This was a tide. The watch saw them first. Glenn, on the tower at dawn, sweeping the tree line with binoculars. He rang the bell we'd mounted on the tower rail. 3 sharp strikes, the signal we'd agreed on for a group sighting. I was on the second floor, and reached the tower in under 2 minutes. And by then, Glenn had the count. 14, he said. Maybe more in the trees. They're coming from the northeast, spread out across maybe 200 feet of frontage. Moving slow. Some are walking, some are crawling. One of them. He handed me the binoculars. Northeast, near the big split birch. I found it. The figure near the birch was taller than the others, and it was standing still while the rest moved. Not walking, not crawling, watching. Its head was turning in slow, deliberate sweeps, and its arms hung at its sides. And there was something about its posture and intentionality, a patience that separated it from the mindless forward push of the others. Is it directing them? I asked. I don't know what it's doing, but it's not doing what they're doing. The first wave hit the wire field 20 minutes later. The cans went off in a cascading rattle that echoed across the compound, and I could see from the tower how the infected responded to the sound, not startled, not deterred, but drawn to it, clustering at the noise points and pushing through the wire with the dead weight of bodies that don't register pain. 3 got tangled and went down, which slowed the ones behind them for a minute, maybe 2. Not enough. They reached the wall. 14 confirmed, plus 3 more that emerged from the southern tree line during the approach. 17 bodies pressed against 8 feet of granite, and for a terrible moment, I thought it was going to hold, and this would be manageable. And then I heard the sound. They were climbing. Not well, not gracefully. Their fingers scrabbled at the stone, their feet kicked against the face, and most of them slid back down. But 3 of them had found the corner where the wall met the natural bluff, where the stone was rougher and the mortar was thinner because we'd been rushing at the end, and they were getting purchase. One of them was already at the 6-foot mark, pulling itself up with a hand strength that cracked the mortar around the stones it gripped. "Webb!" I shouted. He was already there, on the wall walk, a narrow platform we'd built along the inside of the wall's upper edge. He fired down into the climbers. 2 dropped. The third took a round in the shoulder and kept climbing. He fired again, and it fell. But more were at the base now, and they were doing something I hadn't anticipated: piling. The ones who couldn't climb were pressing against the base, and the ones behind them were climbing on top of them, using the bodies of the fallen and the stuck as a ramp. It was mindless and horrifying and terribly, accidentally effective. "The gate," Senna's voice from the ground. I looked and saw 2 of them at the timber gate, not beating on it, pressing, leaning their weight against it in silence. And behind them, 3 more approaching. Theo and Danny were at the gate with makeshift spears, sharpened lengths of pipe we'd prepared for exactly this. They thrust through the gaps between the timbers, and I heard the wet resistance of contact. And I saw Theo's face change, saw the math teacher disappear, and something older and harder take his place. And I thought, this is what it costs. This is what the wall demands. Not just stone and sweat, but the willingness to push sharpened metal through the gap and feel it connect. The fight lasted 40 minutes. We lost no one. We killed 12. The remaining 5 pulled back into the trees after Webb took out the one near the split birch, the tall one, the watcher with a shot that dropped it from 60 yards. When it fell, the others hesitated, paused, lost cohesion. And then they drifted back into the forest, like a wave retreating. We stood on the wall walk, breathing hard, looking at the bodies below. 12 shapes, still now, tangled in wire and piled against the stone. Some of them were wearing hospital gowns. Some of them were wearing uniforms. One police, one that looked like a ferry crew jacket. They'd come from everywhere. They'd come from everything. Elijah, who was 16, and who had stood on the wall walk with a length of rebar in his hands for the entire 40 minutes without being asked. Looked at the bodies, and then looked at his mother. Patrice put her arm around him, and he didn't shrug it off. And that single gesture, a teenager allowing his mother to hold him in front of everyone, told me more about what we'd just survived than any damage assessment could. After the siege, something changed inside the house. Not broken, shifted. The way a building settles after an earthquake, finding its new alignment. People spoke differently, moved differently. The summer residents stopped talking about when the ferries would resume. The full-timers stopped pretending this was temporary. Senna and I walked the wall that evening, inspecting damage. The mortar was cracked in 3 places. 2 stones had been partially dislodged at the climbing point. The gate timbers showed stress fractures where the infected had pressed. It held, I said. Barely. And there were 17. What happens when there are 50, 100? We reinforce. We add a second line. We deepen the gate foundation. And when they learn to pile faster? When more of them are climbers instead of crawlers? I didn't answer because she wasn't looking for an answer. She was testing me. Testing whether I would retreat into the architect's optimism, the builder's faith that enough stone solves everything, or whether I could hold the truth she was offering. That walls are time, not salvation. That everything we'd built was a delay, not a solution. What do you suggest? I asked. I suggest we think about what happens if we can't stay. Where would we go? I don't know, but I want to know we've thought about it. I want to know there's a plan that isn't just thicker walls. This was when Harlan stepped into something larger than his radio desk. He'd been monitoring frequencies throughout the crisis, mostly receiving static, occasionally catching fragments of automated broadcasts. But that evening, he called me to the radio room with a voice that had a new quality in it, not excitement, but purpose. I raced someone, he said. An hour ago, a station on Venalhaven that's an island about 30 miles up the coast. A woman named Judith. She's got a group, 40-something people, fortified in a school building. They've been there since the beginning. Are they okay? They're alive. They've got similar problems, infected washing up, supply issues, isolation. But they're organized, and they've been in contact with 2 other island groups, Monaghan and Islesboro. There are survivors on both. I sat down. The information hit me with a physical force, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. We were not alone. Out there on the water, on other rocks in the Atlantic, other groups of people were building walls and watching the tree line and burning bodies on the shore. Can we coordinate? I asked. Maybe. The range is limited. But Judith has a stronger transmitter, and she's willing to relay. She's been keeping a log of infection patterns, tidal data, weather effects on the infected. She says cold slows them. Really cold, not just cool. And she says the ones in the water are less active at depth. They seem to stay near the surface. Information. Real information, gathered by real observation, shared between real people. It felt like oxygen after weeks of holding my breath. I told the group that night. The effect was immediate and complicated. Hope, yes, visible in the way shoulders dropped from their defensive hunch, in the way Bryn smiled for the first time since arriving. But also fear, because knowledge of others meant knowledge of a larger picture. And the larger picture was this. Every island off the coast of Maine was under the same siege. The mainland was silent. The ferries were gone, and the ocean was full of the dead. Ray asked the question that hung over all of it. If the islands are the only safe places left, how long before more people try to reach them? Not infected. People, living people. in boats, on rafts. And what do we do when they show up? The room went quiet. This was a door none of us had opened yet, and behind it was a moral complexity that made the infected seem simple by comparison. A crawler at the wall was a problem with a clear solution. A boat full of desperate survivors was a problem that would break us in ways no siege could. "We take them in," Danny said immediately. "That's not a question." "It's absolutely a question," Webb said. He was standing by the window, rifle in the crook of his arm, his voice flat. "Every person we take in is another mouth, another body to shelter, another variable. If 30 people show up tomorrow, we don't have the food, we don't have the space, and we don't know what they're carrying." "You mean infection?" "I mean everything. Infection, trauma, desperation. People who've been through what the Mainland went through aren't going to walk in here and follow the rules of a place they didn't build." Danny turned to me. Webb turned to me. Everyone turned to me. And I stood there in the great room of the Rourke place, in the house I hadn't built but had fortified, in the community I hadn't founded but had organized. And I felt the specific loneliness of the person who has to decide, not because they're wisest or strongest, but because no one else will. "We take them in," I said, "and we figure out the rest." Webb held my gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned back to the window. It wasn't agreement. It was acceptance of my authority to decide, which was close enough for now. The boat came 3 days later. Not survivors, not the way we'd imagined. Harlan saw it first on his dawn sweep from the tower. A fishing trawler, commercial-sized, drifting southeast about a mile offshore. No running lights, no engine sound. It was turning slowly in the current, presenting its port side to us. And even through binoculars, I could see the deck was wrong, too much movement for an empty vessel, too little pattern for a crude one. We watched it for 2 hours. It drifted closer. By mid-morning, it was half a mile out. And through the rifle scope, Glenn confirmed what we already suspected. 12, maybe 15 on deck, all infected. Vessels adrift, no one at the helm. It's going to ground on the south shore if the current holds. A boat full of infected, delivering itself to our island like a package nobody ordered. The randomness of it was almost worse than malice. There was no enemy to outthink. Just the mindless arithmetic of current and wind and bodies that didn't know they were dead. "How long until it hits?" I asked. 2 hours, maybe 3. Depends on the tide. I had 2 hours to solve a problem I'd never imagined designing for. A wall protects against approach from land. It does nothing about a vessel grounding on your shore and disgorging a dozen infected 50 feet from your perimeter. Senna came up with the answer, because Senna always saw the threat before I could build against it. "We don't let it ground," she said. "We go out to it and we sink it." "In what?" "We banned water access." "I know what we banned. I also know that Corwin's Slip isn't the only boat in the harbor. There's a lobster boat, the one with the blue hull." "Harlan, does it run?" Harlan confirmed it ran. He'd maintained it himself, a favor for the owner who'd gone back to the mainland before the ferry stopped. We took the lobster boat out. Senna, Webb, Glenn, and me. I didn't want to go the memory of Dale. The water churning red around him was a physical weight in my gut, but this was my settlement, my wall, my responsibility. And sending others to do the dangerous thing while I watched from shore was a line I wasn't willing to cross. The trawler was listing slightly to starboard, low in the water. As we approached, the smell reached us first, that same sweet chemical scent from the woods, but concentrated, gagging, a smell that seemed to coat the inside of my mouth. The infected on deck had noticed us. They were at the rail, clustered on the port side, reaching toward the sound of our engine. Some were making that wet breathing sound. One of them fell over the rail into the water and disappeared beneath the surface without a splash. "Don't get close," Glenn said, rifle at his shoulder. "They'll come over the side." Webb brought us alongside at 30 feet. Glenn picked off the ones at the rail, methodical, mechanical, the Forest Service marksman doing what the Forest Service marksman could do. 8 shots, 8 down. Then silence. Senna was watching the water. "The one that went in," she said. "It's under us." I felt the hull bump. Not hard a nudge, like a log in a current. Then another bump, from a different angle. Then the boat rocked, and I grabbed the gunwale and looked down into the water and saw a face looking up at me from 3 feet below the surface. Milky eyes, open mouth, hands reaching for the hull, fingers finding the keel and gripping. "Move," I said to Webb. He hit the throttle and the lobster boat surged forward, and the thing in the water fell away behind us. We circled back to the trawler's far side, where the deck was clear now. Webb brought us closer. I leaned over with the hatchet and put 3 holes in the trawler's hull at the waterline, striking the planking with everything I had, feeling the wood give way, seeing water begin to pour in. We moved to the stern, and I did it again, and again. We pulled back and watched the trawler settle. It took almost an hour. Sinking is slower than the movies suggest, but it went down. Stern first, the bow rising as the hull filled, the remaining bodies on deck sliding into the water as the angle increased. It settled in about 40 feet of water, half a mile from shore. Some of the infected would walk the ocean floor toward the island. We knew that, but they'd be slowed by depth and current, and they'd arrive in 1s and 2s, manageable numbers. On the ride back to the harbor, Senna sat beside me at the stern. She was soaked from spray, and her jaw was clenched, and she looked like someone who'd been holding a breath for years and had decided to keep holding it. "How many trawlers are out there?" she asked. "I don't know." "How many ferries? Container ships? Pleasure boats?" "Every vessel on the Atlantic that had infected aboard is drifting right now. Some of them will drift to us. We'll deal with them when they come. That's what you said about the wall, and we built the wall. And then 17 came, and it almost wasn't enough." She was right. She was always right about the threat. That was her gift and her curse, to see clearly the thing that was coming, and to carry that clarity alone until she could find someone willing to carry it with her. "Then we build something else," I said. "We always build something else." She looked at me for a long time. Then she reached out and put her hand over mine on the gunwale. Briefly, a contact that lasted 2 seconds and meant more than any speech I'd given to the group. It meant, "I'm here." It meant, "I see what you're carrying, and I'm carrying it too." It meant, "We are not alone, even though everything around us insists that we are." Month 2. I stopped counting days somewhere around day 35, when the days started to feel less like individual units and more like a continuous present tense, a permanent now in which the past was a luxury and the future was a construction project. The fortress had grown beyond my original plans. The main wall now ran a complete circuit, connecting with the natural bluff on both ends. We'd built a second, lower wall 4 feet high, 20 feet inside the first, creating a kill zone that slowed and channeled any infected that breached the outer perimeter. The Watchtower had been reinforced and raised to 15 feet. with a rain shelter and a signaling mirror that Harlan used to communicate with a fishing vessel that passed every 9 days, a relay to Judith's group on Vinalhaven. We'd fortified the harbor dock with a gate of its own, and we'd built a crude breakwater from sunken logs and stone that forced any approach by water through a narrow channel where Glenn could cover from the tower. The garden was growing. Marcia and Patrice had turned a 1/4 acre of ground inside the perimeter into a producing plot: lettuce, radishes, potatoes, beans. Not enough to sustain us, but enough to supplement. We'd learned to fish from the wall long rods dangled over the bluff on the west side, where the water was deep close to shore and the infected seemed less active. It wasn't safe. Nothing was safe. But hunger has a way of recalibrating your risk tolerance. 33 people now. We'd lost Dale to the water. Corwin never came back. Francine had left on day 22, taking a kayak in the night, leaving a note that said only, "I can't." And 2 more had come to us, a man and a woman in a sailboat, half dead from exposure, who'd sailed from Bar Harbor and spent 9 days on the water dodging vessels that moved without crews. Their names were Oscar and June. Oscar had been a veterinarian. June had been a postal worker. They were both now whatever we all were, survivors of something that didn't have a name we'd agreed on. Oscar brought information. Bar Harbor was gone, not destroyed, he said, but emptied. The infected had pushed through over a period of days, and the living had scattered, some inland, some to the islands, some to nowhere. He'd seen military vehicles on Route 1, abandoned, doors open. He'd seen a helicopter on the ground in a Walmart parking lot, rotors still, no pilot. And he'd seen the infected in numbers that made our 17 seem quaint hundreds, filling streets, moving in those loose aggregations that weren't quite herds and weren't quite swarms, but had a collective momentum that overwhelmed any fixed defense. "They don't stop," Oscar said. He was sitting in the great room, a blanket around his shoulders, a cup of Patrice's rationed coffee in his hands. "That's what people don't understand until they see it. They don't sleep. They don't eat. Not that I could see. They don't rest. They just move. And when they reach something they can't get through, they don't go around it. They press against it until it breaks, or they do." "Walls hold," I said. And even as I said it, I heard how it sounded not like confidence, but like prayer. "Walls hold until they don't," Oscar said. "I watched a brick building in Bar Harbor come down because 300 of them pressed against the same wall for 6 hours. Not breaking it, just pressing. The weight brought it down." 300. I thought about our wall, 2 feet thick, 8 feet high. Granite, which was stronger than brick, but not infinitely stronger. Nothing is infinitely stronger than a force that doesn't stop. That night, I sat with Danny in the medical station. He was inventorying bandages, which he did every 3 days with a meticulousness that was either discipline or compulsion. His hands were steady. They'd been steady through the siege, through Dale's death, through every sutured cut and splinted bone. My brother's hands were the most reliable thing in my life. "Do you think about Mom?" he asked without looking up. "Every day?" "Do you think she's alive?" I didn't answer. Danny nodded, as if my silence was the honest response, and anything else would have been a lie dressed as comfort. "She told us not to come home," he said. "In her text, she said stay on the island. She knew what was coming, Marcus. Before we did. Before anyone on the island did. She told us to stay. Mom always knew things before other people did." Danny set down the bandages. He looked at me, and his eyes were red, and his jaw was set in that configuration I'd seen at our father's funeral. That arrangement that wasn't anger and wasn't grief, but was both, compressed into something harder than either. I want to believe she's in the basement, he said, with the canned goods and the radio and the generator. I want to believe she heard the emergency broadcasts, and she went downstairs, and she sealed the bulkhead door. And she's been there this whole time, rationing peanut butter and listening for the all clear. Then believe that. I can't, because if I believe it and it's not true, then losing it will be worse than never having it. This was Danny's survival psychology, the EMT's pragmatism, the refusal to invest hope in an unverified outcome. It kept him functional. It kept him sharp. And it was slowly eating him alive from the inside, because the thing about refusing to hope is that it doesn't actually stop you from hoping. It just makes you ashamed of it. I put my hand on his shoulder. He didn't shrug it off. We sat there together in the medical station with the bandages and the rationed iodine and the list of names on the wall, our people, our 33, each name written in Danny's careful hand. And we shared the grief the way we'd shared a bedroom as kids, silently, close together, pretending we were asleep. The last test came on a Tuesday, though I only know it was a Tuesday because Harlan kept a calendar on the radio desk, marking each day with a small X that had the quality of a ritual. Week 9. A fog had rolled in overnight, the kind of thick Atlantic fog that turns the world into a white room with no walls, and the watch couldn't see past 20 feet from the tower. Glenn smelled them before he heard them. He told me later it was the chemical smell, the sweet wrongness, and it was stronger than he'd ever registered, and it was coming from every direction. The bell rang. 3 strikes, then 3 more, then continuous, the signal we'd never used, the signal that meant everywhere. I was on the wall in 2 minutes. I couldn't see the tree line. I couldn't see the wire field. I could see the base of the wall and about 10 feet of ground beyond it. And in that 10 feet, shapes were appearing out of the fog like figures in a developing photograph. Not 17, not 50. The sound told me before my eyes did. That wet collective breathing, multiplied, layered. A sound like the ocean itself had learned to exhale through broken throats. They hit the wall along its entire eastern face at once, and the sound of bodies against stone was a vibration I felt through my boots, through my legs, through my spine. "Everyone on the wall," I shouted. People came, all of them. Theo with his spear, Patrice with a sharpened broom handle, Elijah with a rebar, Ray with a boat hook, Danny with nothing because his hands were his tools, and he was already moving toward the wounded before they were wounded. And Senna, with her crowbar, standing beside me, her face set in that expression I'd come to understand as her version of calm, not the absence of fear, but the complete subordination of it. They piled. Oscar had warned us, and here it was. Bodies pressing against the base, more bodies climbing the pile, hands reaching over the top. The wall held. The stone held. But they weren't trying to break the stone, they were trying to climb it, and the pile was growing. And the ones on top were reaching the 7-foot mark, the 8-foot mark, fingers curling over the edge. We fought them at the top. Webb fired until his ammunition ran low, then switched to the hatchet. Glenn covered the gate, where the pressure was bending the timbers inward. Theo and Corwin's replacement, a quiet summer resident named Paul, who'd never spoken in a meeting and who turned out to fight with a cold, mechanical efficiency, held the northeast corner where the climbers were thickest. I don't know how long it lasted. In memory, it's both endless and instantaneous, the way a car accident is. I remember specific moments with hallucinatory clarity, the face of an infected woman who reached the top of the wall directly in front of me, her mouth open, her eyes finding mine with something that might have been recognition. And Senna's crowbar coming down, and the face disappearing. I remember Elijah screaming, not in fear but in effort. A 16-year-old boy driving rebar into the dark with both hands. His mother 5 feet away doing the same thing. And neither of them looking at each other because looking away from the wall meant dying. I remember the moment it broke. Not the wall, the attack. Something shifted in their behavior, some signal or stimulus that didn't register in my senses, and the pressure eased. The ones at the base began to pull back. The climbers fell away. The fog was thinning, and through it, I could see them retreating, not fleeing, just withdrawing. That same loose collective drift, like birds reforming after a murmuration collapses. We'd held, 16 of us on the wall, the rest supporting from below. And we'd held against a force I never counted, because counting would have required a precision of attention I couldn't afford at the time. Later, we counted the bodies. 43 at the base of the wall, more in the wire field, more in the tree line. The wall had cracked in 2 places. One section had shifted 3 inches inward. The gate timbers were bowed and would need replacing, but it had held. I climbed down from the wall and sat on the ground with my back against the stone and my arms shaking and my hands bloody from a dozen small cuts I didn't remember receiving. Senna sat beside me. Danny crouched in front of me and took my hands and examined them with his steady, careful fingers. And then he looked at my face and said, "You're okay." I know. No, I mean, you're okay. This is okay. We're okay. He wasn't talking about the cuts. He was talking about the thing I'd built. The wall, the watchtower, the kill zone, the community, the system, the blueprint that lived inside my head and was now alive in stone and timber, and in the hands of 33 people who'd stood on it and fought. I looked up at the wall. My wall. Our wall. And I understood, finally, what I'd really been building. Not a perimeter, not a fortification, a commitment. An act of faith rendered in granite the belief that holding ground matters, that staying is a form of courage, that the people inside the walls are worth the cost of defending them. The fog lifted. The sun came through. And the island, battered and bloodied and impossibly still standing, turned its face toward the light. We're still here. That's the thing I come back to when the nights are long and the radio is silent and the ocean makes sounds I've learned not to investigate. We're still here. The wall has been rebuilt twice. The garden feeds us through the short summers, and we preserve what we can for the winters that test everything. The walls, the stores, the patience of people living in close quarters with grief as a permanent roommate. Harlan maintains contact with the other islands. There are 7 groups now, scattered along the coast, and Judith on Vinalhaven has started calling us the Archipelago, which sounds grander than it feels when you're patching mortar in the rain. Danny runs the medical ward with the authority of someone who found his calling inside a catastrophe. Senna watches the tree line. Webb maintains the rifles. Patrice feeds us with a discipline that borders on art. Elijah, who is 17 now and taller than his mother, stands on the wall walk every evening and looks east. And I don't know what he sees there, the future, maybe, or the memory of the boy he was before all this, or just the dark. I still think in blueprints. I draw plans for structures we might build a second settlement, a harbor fortification, a bridge between the things we have and the things we need. The architect in me never stops reaching for the next wall, the next design, the next negotiation with the forces that would bring us down. But what I've learned, what the island taught me, what the wall taught me, what 43 bodies at the base of a granite perimeter taught me, is that the structure is not the stone. The structure is the agreement. The decision, made in a room full of frightened strangers, that we would stay and build and hold, that we would be, against all evidence and all odds, a place that stands. The last ferry left without us, so we built a fortress on the island instead. And every morning, when the sun hits the wall, and the watch reports all clear, and Patrice rings the bell for breakfast, I think, the ferry left us behind. Thank God the ferry left us behind.